Geography still matters in war. The time that it takes for a drone or a missile to reach the capital for a decapitation strike matters and is clearly seen to matter by the great powers. The United States really did not want nuclear weapons in Cuba, and Russia really does not want the United States military in Ukraine. And when they say it over the years, they have said it, we don't want to be 3 minutes away, a missile strike. They're quite explicit about it. One of the most destabilizing things that the United States did, in my view, is completely underrated, but I think it probably loomed just about as large as anything in the Russian mind, though you two would know better than I, and that is walking out of the ABM Treaty in 2002 and starting to put anti-ballistic missile systems, the Aegis systems, in Poland and Romania. To my mind, this was not a small thing in the Russian thinking. This was seen, it's claimed by Russian security experts, as perhaps setting up for a decapitation strike, as really undermining the balance of power, as really undermining deterrence. I credit that argument. I don't brush aside that argument. I think the United States would go absolutely wild if Russia started building anti-ballistic missiles along our rim. So I think, while I don't have the maps to show you here, I think we could do much better than we're doing right now to understand that certain areas are just so provocative and so risky. And I would put Ukraine very high on that list. And I would put Georgia very high on that list. I would put the South Caucasus very high on that list. I also want to recall that all the poobahs of American neocon foreign policy were the friends of Chechnya at the end of the 1990s. I doubt one of them knew where Chechnya really was, but they knew it could annoy the hell out of the Russians. And so they wanted to use Chechnya to weaken Russia. And this is what I say we need to avoid. So I don't want to claim that there's a clear, rigid line, but I also don't want to say that the lack of precision means that the idea is valueless. The idea actually should have a military component. If there were no military component to it, what I'm saying doesn't really matter. I think that it does matter, though. The proximity of the military of the other side really does matter, in my view. And that's the basic proposition. It raises 100 issues I'd love to spend hours discussing with you. But why did the Soviet Union occupy Central and Eastern Europe after World War II? Of course, the normal idea is, well, they wanted to make a global communist system. But I think the real reason was that they were afraid of Germany remilitarizing. And the United States refused a neutral, demilitarized Germany as a point of principle and instead established NATO and the Federal Republic of Germany as a core part of NATO. And at German insistence, but frankly, I wouldn't have gone with German insistence. I would have gone with the idea that Stalin had and that George Kennan had, that a neutral, demilitarized Germany would have been a great benefit for everybody. So, and that, I think, could have brought the Cold War to an end much sooner. Let me turn to the third category problem, that mutual security guarantees can't last. And I want to say a couple of conceptual things. I know time is short, but we're not in a zero-sum game. We're in a negative-sum game. When we have an arms race, when we have a competition that can spill over to disaster, this is a negative-sum game. As an economist, I'm always desperately trying to find the efficient outcome. So people who know the prisoner's dilemma game, the famous game, the so-called equilibrium or the Nash equilibrium of the prisoner's dilemma is not a zero-sum outcome, it's a negative sum. Cooperation by both sides is better, but everybody has the incentive to cheat. So you end up with a cheat equilibrium, or what they call the defect equilibrium. But that's not zero sum, that's negative sum. It offends an economist. We're all for efficiency. In other words, you can make both sides better off by reaching the mutual accommodation. And then the endless question is, well, how do you enforce that when there's an incentive to cheat? And what game theory teaches us is several different things. One is that if you're in repeated play, it's more complicated than just one-off cheating. And so there is an incentive to stick by a treaty. Not perfect, but it's not zero either. And so the future casts a shadow over the decisions of the present. The nuclear arms treaties actually have worked, except when the U.S. unilaterally walked out on them. That proves both John's point and my point. John's point is, well, the U.S. walked out on them. My point is that the Soviets and the Russians actually obeyed them. And this is very important. When President John F. Kennedy was trying to convince the American people of the partial nuclear test ban treaty, he said, well, this is in Russia's Soviet incentive and our incentive to stick by it because it's mutually beneficial. It's a positive sum compared to a nuclear arms race. He convinced the Senate by an overwhelming majority, and the Soviets stuck by the partial nuclear test ban treaty. He also said something very important, that he was not looking for, the miracle age when conflicts go away. I think that we're in a non-stop struggle with the reality that John portrays. In other words, of course there's cheating. Of course no treaty will last forever. But let's stay alive the next 20 years. Let's do the best we can. Let's sign treaties, try to abide by them, use the reputation effects. Game theory has established that there are many, many ways to have cooperation in an iterated prisoner's dilemma. It's reciprocity, it's indirect reciprocity, as they call it, that you lose your reputation to others. It's collective punishment, which brings a higher level of governance above your head than the UN Security Council putting on sanctions and so on. None of this works all that well, I admit. But it's better to stay alive and try these things and make them work as best we can than to just say that we're in a war of all against all, almost as an inevitability, because I really don't believe that. And I think that the idea is things will change. Someone will violate this. Let's go back to the logic of positive sum games or negative sum possibilities and redo it if we have to in the future. So I don't deny the difficulties, but I also think that both the formal game theory, if you could say, and historical experience shows there are periods of peace that are actually constructed. And they're constructed in part on treaties and mutual agreements, and they last for a long time. And then they don't last. And then you have a big risk of war. I'm very worried that the logic, it's going to happen, war is going to happen. I just hate the nuclear reality of it right now, which is that I do believe in this concept of the nuclear revolution, that something's really, truly horrifically different now in our reality. We really have a nuclear sword of Damocles over our head, so we have to try even harder to get this right. Then the third point that John mentioned, which was number 2 in his counting, which is that we would have continued competition elsewhere. And I think a perfect case of that would be Chinese and U.S. competition in Africa, for example. Everybody wants cobalt. Everybody wants copper. Everybody wants the resources. Everybody wants the votes, perhaps in the UN, whatever. And so Africa is not in either America's or China's or Russia's or India's sphere of security. It's just far away. And so there will be competition there. Now, what would one say about that? I would say, yes, that's true. I would, of course, try to avoid it. My main logic on that case would be to go to the Africans themselves and say, get into that union, because you're a lot safer in an African union of 55 countries than being picked apart by the major powers. But I think Africa is exactly the kind of playground of competition that John is talking about. It's real. It's true. But it's much less likely to devolve to nuclear war and much more likely to, it could even be local skirmishes or even wars or coups or other things, no doubt. But it is unlikely to be the trigger of a nuclear war because even literally there's more time in space. It's not in the other face. So bottom line for me is we do have mechanisms of cooperation that are imperfect, but are real. We cooperate more than single period prisoner's dilemmas or hawk dove games in the jargon imply. We're better at that because we know how dangerous they are. Being negative sum means there's really an advantage to holding to a cooperative outcome. And we can use so-called trigger strategies, which are, if you break this agreement, I'd break 10 agreements in the future, or other kinds of means, treaties literally, or reputational costs to make a difference. And just to add one point on this, the West, the US and Europe thought, I believe, that when the Ukraine war escalated, Putin would be isolated worldwide. And they spoke as if, oh, the whole world knows this man's a tyrant. And of course, it didn't happen, a point that the three of us have been making constantly. President Putin is very well respected, thank you, in well over 100 countries in the world. Why? Because he's not seen to have violated norms the way that the West portrays him as violating the norms. If you go to a leader in Africa or to a leader in Asia, they say, why did the US provoke this war? They don't see this as the unprovoked war that the US claims it to be or that Europe claims it to be. Putin did not incur a high reputational cost from this war because, in my view, in substance, what he did was provoked, as John Mearsheimer explained to us all in 2014. And so, in my view, this is an example of reputation matters. But Putin didn't lose reputationally, only in the bubble of Western propaganda, not in the worldwide opinion, because it was seen to be a violation of a norm by the US. Why are they so aggressive? Why are they pushing NATO? Why are they trying to be in Ukraine? Why did they overthrow a government in February 2014? And on and on. And in that sense, it seems to me this idea that reputation can help to secure agreements, not forever, but better than just outright we're locked in struggle viewpoint, is a real point and a constructive point, and we should use it constantly because we need to stumble forward generation to generation without blowing ourselves up. And I very much love President John F. Kennedy's peace speech of June 10, 1963. I wrote a book about it because I like it so much. And one thing he says I think is very important. He says, peace is a process, a way of solving problems. So it's not a grand solution. It's not the end of realism at all, but it is a process that we should use to our advantage, to our mutual advantage.